Imagine that you are terribly sick. You're in extreme amounts of pain that no amount of medicine can help. You know you're going to die soon, and the rest of your life is really only going to be immense suffering. If you had the option to end your life through euthanasia, would you? So, euthanasia is the intentional termination of a person's life. It's typically performed on very sick patients in order to end their suffering. The legality of euthanasia is a subject of hot debate both in and outside of the medical field. And in the US, attitudes about euthanasia have actually changed a lot just in a couple of years. So, a 2013 poll found that 67% of US citizens were against euthanasia, but by 2017, almost 75% supported it. So, it's a pretty extreme change in opinion. So, in this speech, we will hear two different philosophers' arguments on the morality of euthanasia. First, we will explore James Rachel's views on active and passive euthanasia, and how he claims there is no moral difference between killing and letting die. Foote disagrees with Rachel's and claims that agency is more important than the distinction between killing and letting die. Rachel's argues in favor of active euthanasia on the point that killing is equivalent to letting die, while Philippa Foote argues that positive and negative rights determine the morality of actions, including euthanasia. So first, we're going to explore Rachel's arguments. And he starts out by saying active euthanasia is in many cases more humane than passive euthanasia. So the process of being allowed to die can be relatively slow and painful. So basically, the doctor has ceased treatment or stopped nutrition and the body just sort of goes away on its own. But in active euthanasia, there's a lethal injection, so it's relatively quick and painless. So he starts with an example where a patient is dying of incurable throat cancer. He's in incredible pain that cannot be alleviated. He will die whether treatment is continued or not, and he and his family ask the doctor to end the treatment. So suppose the doctor agrees to stop the treatment as the AMA doctrine allows. And it's justified by the idea that, the patient is in agony, he's going to die anyway, so it's wrong to prolong his suffering needlessly. But if one simply withholds treatment, it's probably going to take the patient longer to die than if they were given a lethal injection. So this provides evidence that once the decision has been made to perform euthanasia, active euthanasia is actually preferable because it's going to be reducing suffering more. So he brings in another example, and he tells us about how 1 out of 600 babies in the US are born with Down syndrome. Some of those babies are also born with a congenital defect, like an intestinal obstruction, and this would require surgery to fix. Sometimes the parents and doctors decide not to operate and let the child die. And when the surgery isn't performed, the infants slowly die from dehydration and infection. And Rachel's basically says, having no euthanasia allowed at all is understandable. But why would days of suffering be preferable to a quick and painless death? And he keeps going with the example of the Down syndrome children, and he explains how the conventional AMA doctrine actually leads to decisions, like life and death decisions, made on irrelevant grounds. So the surgery to remove this intestinal blockage, it's not difficult or expensive. These children aren't dying because they need surgery, but because they have Down syndrome and their parents don't want a child with Down syndrome. If their life was worth preserving, why would they be concerned about a simple operation? And if they think a baby with Down syndrome should die, why does it matter if they have an intestinal blockage or not? It's the Down syndrome, not the intestines, that's the issue. And the matter of killing the child or letting it live should be decided on this basis. What makes this situation possible is that the idea that when the baby has an intestinal blockage, you can let them die, but when there's no problem, you can't kill them. So basically, it's having you make the decision based on irrelevant grounds. And if the doctrine is guiding you to make poor decisions, then it's probably not a very good doctrine. So then he moves on to how killing is morally equivalent to letting die, and he explains this through the Smith and Jones example. So Smith will gain a large inheritance if his 6-year-old cousin dies, and one night, Smith sneaks into the bathroom and he drowns his cousin in the bathtub in order to gain the inheritance. Jones is in the same position as Smith. Jones plans to drown his cousin in the bath, but when he comes in, he sees his cousin slip, fall, and drown in the bathtub. Jones is really happy about that. He wanted it to happen. And if the child, tried to get up, he would have drowned it. That was his intent. He had killing intent. But the child dies on its own. He doesn't have to do anything, and he just lets the child die. So if killing was morally worse than letting die on its own, just the action itself, one should say Jones's behavior was less wrong than Smith's. But both men acted from the same motive, personal gain. Both men had the same end in view when they acted. And you would infer from Smith's actions that he's not a good person. So wouldn't the same hold for Jones? Let's say Jones got found out and he pleaded in court, oh, well, I didn't kill my cousin, I only let him die. Probably wouldn't be a very good excuse. So if letting die was morally better than killing, you would imagine the defense would have some weight, but it doesn't. So that sort of shows why killing and letting die is equivalent. Now, he sort of takes in one of the criticisms, which would be like, this case really isn't similar to euthanasia. And that's true, but the point remains. Because, if a doctor lets a patient die for humane reasons, he's in the same moral position than if he gave the patient lethal injection. Like, if his decision was wrong, the decision would be equally regrettable, no matter which method was used to carry it out. And if the doctor was correct, then the method doesn't really matter, the end result's still going to be the same. So he goes on to explain that there's insufficient evidence to distinguish between killing and letting die in the matter of euthanasia. So the AMA policy states the crucial issue with active and passive euthanasia is the intentional termination of the life of one human being by another. It forbids mercy killing, but it says that cessation of treatment is not the intentional termination of life. Rachels argues that's exactly what it is, and if it weren't, there wouldn't be a point. The decision to let a patient die is subject to moral appraisal in the same way the decision to kill him would be. If a doctor deliberately let a patient die who was suffering from a curable illness, he would be just as culpable as he would be for shooting him. It's no defense that he didn't do anything. A non-action, in this case, is considered an action in itself. Rachels argues that people find this lack of distinction hard to accept because most cases of killing are more reprehensible than most cases of letting die. People hear about killing often. Murders are reported in the news, but people really rarely hear about letting die, and really the only time you hear about it, it's doctors being motivated by humanitarian reasons. But just because we have these associations does not automatically make killing worse than letting die.